Hello and welcome. You're watching this VOA WION co-production with me, Neha Khanna. Let's begin with our top story. Democrats already in control of the US Senate by the slimmest of margins, but the final balance of power will be decided in the southern state of Georgia on the 6th of December with a runoff election between Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock and Republican challenger Herschel Walker. VOA's Congressional Correspondent Katherine Gypson has more.
Voters in the southern state of Georgia headed back to the polls this week with a choice that will impact the entire nation. Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock.
And I got a feeling that I'm going to finish first one more time.
And Republican challenger Herschel Walker.
Guys, we don't have no more time. We don't have no more time. What they've done to this country in 2 short years.
Both failed to achieve a 50% majority of votes in the November midterm election, leading to this runoff that will decide if Democrats will hold a 51-seat majority in the Senate next year.
It's very rare that you go an entire Congress, an entire 2 years, where some senator doesn't leave, whether by choice or retirement, God forbid, a death. And so having that 1-seat majority it can be a really big difference maker.
If Walker wins, Democrats will be forced to continue breaking ties in the U.S. Senate with the vote of Vice President Kamala Harris. If Warnock wins, analysts say Democrats will secure a key advantage.
It's important to the committee structure. You know, that was a shared committee responsibility now, and you'll have clear chairs who kind of drive the calendar, drive what issues will come up, you know, in front of the Senate.
Both Walker and Warnock have faced controversies about their character, with Warnock facing questions about his record as a landlord and Walker facing allegations he paid for abortions. Republican voters say they will still vote for Walker.
He has made mistakes, you know, and he shares his views. And, you know, what's important is the here and now and the future, you know, and the survival of our country.
Warnock is making the case that Democrats will protect abortion rights and are helping rebuild the economy.
The Democratic Party and Senator Warnock in particular really kind of focus on the everyday issues of everyday Americans.
This runoff election marks the second time in 2 years that Georgia voters have played a key role in deciding control of the U.S. Senate. Katherine Gypson, VOA News, Washington.
VOA correspondent Jessica Stone joins us live now from the White House. Jessica, not much time left for the current Congress to act in this calendar year. What are some of the major issues that they're working on?
Well, the primary thing they need to do is they need to pass a budget in just 2 weeks. The funding for the U.S. government runs out. So by December 16th, both houses of government need to pass that. It is also going to include about $38 billion in funding for Ukraine. In addition, they need to pass a military spending bill, some federal election reform legislation, and raising the nation's borrowing limit. Add to that, they've just in the last 24 hours put a stop to a national rail strike, the Senate voting yesterday to extend the current contract so that Christmas and Hanukkah presents could be delivered, that the U.S. economy wouldn't falter because the nation's railways would be at a halt. They're also working on some same-sex marriage protections as well as interracial marriage protections. The House has passed that. It's a little bit more questionable whether that will go forward in the Senate. So there's a lot on the table, but front and center is this issue of funding the U.S. government. Neha?
All right. That is very interesting indeed, Jessica. Now, the House committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol is expected to consider criminal referrals later today. What are some of the possibilities here?
It's an interesting question you ask. A smaller group of members of this committee, the January 6th House Committee that investigated the January 6th attack, is going to make a presentation to the larger committee, making an argument for a range of charges that could include obstruction of justice, perjury, which of course is lying under oath, or witness tampering. All of those are on the table. But interestingly enough, it comes on the heels of some major convictions for the U.S. Department of Justice for major players in that attack, primarily the person who leads a group called the Oath Keepers, which is a far-right group that was involved in charges of seditious conspiracy and was convicted on those charges. That founder, Stuart Rhodes, and another leader of the group were found guilty of planning the attack, essentially to use force to block the peaceful transfer of power from President Trump to President Biden on January 6th. So analysts say that does strengthen the hand of the January 6th committee. We expect to get a full report from that committee by the end of the month. Neha.
Thanks so much for that, Jessica, but we'll request you to stay on with us. We will come back to you in just a moment for details on our next story. Now, the pace of China's accelerating nuclear expansion may enable Beijing to field a stockpile of about 1,500 warheads by 2035. That's according to the Pentagon's annual China military power report to the Congress, which was released on Tuesday. WION Pentagon correspondent Carla Bob has more details.
A new Pentagon report says China has more than 400 nuclear warheads, nearly doubling its nuclear arsenal in just 2 years. It also says Beijing launched roughly 135 ballistic missiles for testing and training last year, more than the rest of the world combined, when you exclude ballistic missiles launched in conflict zones like Ukraine.
If one looks at the capability and capacity of China's missile arsenal, it's breathtaking.
The Pentagon calls China its pacing challenge.
China is the one country out there that geopolitically has the power potential to be a significant challenge to the United States. And they are.
And according to the report, China has increased what the Pentagon calls unsafe and unprofessional military behavior toward the U.S. and its allies in the region, especially, as defense analyst Bradley Bowman points out, toward the democratic island of Taiwan.
They've refused to take military force against Taiwan off the table, explicitly refused to do so. And they're undertaking the actions of a country that means what they say, and that is they're getting ready to potentially conduct an attack against Taiwan.
A potential attack, the Pentagon says, is not in the near term, despite recent aggressions.
As the report highlights, we don't believe that an invasion is imminent.
But a senior defense official told reporters China has created a new normal around Taiwan in terms of military activity. Immediately after U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August, China ramped up drills, missile launches, and strait crossings. Those eventually decreased, but are still routine, the official said, rather than reserved for rare occasions, as was China's practice before the visit. China's defense minister told U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin in Cambodia last week that Beijing considers Taiwan to be a, quote, red line, and that aggression has spilled into areas including the South China Sea, where the USS Chancellorsville completed a freedom of navigation operation to promote free passage through international waters that carry half the world's merchant fleet tonnage, worth trillions of dollars each year.
I know that there has been some reporting that China essentially ejected our ship from the areas. That is not true. Again, we'll continue to sail, fly, and operate wherever international law allows.
China claims much of the sea as its territory and has ignored an international court ruling holding that Beijing has no historic title over the South China Sea. Carla Babb, VOA News, the Pentagon.
VOA's Jessica Stone is still with us from Washington. Jessica, some Chinese cities are beginning to lift COVID lockdowns in response to the protests across that country. What is the reaction so far from Washington?
Well, there's been a pretty unanimous reaction from the financial community here in Washington. That is to say, the World Bank president, David Malpass, was interviewed on Bloomberg this week and called on China specifically to lift the zero COVID lockdown, saying that it's terrible for the Chinese economy as well as the global economy. That was echoed by IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva, who also said, look, you've got to lift these lockdowns. It's really bad for your economy and for the global economy as well. And we're seeing on Wall Street some impacts immediately on major companies. Let's take Disney, for example. Disney had to shut down Disney Shanghai just 4 days after reopening because of the zero COVID policy. And Apple's Foxconn is also making a lot of iPhones, of course, in China. That there's a real concern on Wall Street that they won't be able to meet demand for the holidays because of these policies. And all of this comes, of course, as China now prepares to publicly mourn Jiang Zemin, the former president, at a time when public gatherings are often resulting in these protests, and at a time when they do have these very high numbers of COVID to reckon with. Neha?
Right. Clearly, that is a difficult situation for China at the moment. Jessica, next week, Taiwanese semiconductor company TSMC will host President Joe Biden at its new plant in Arizona. This factory has become a symbol of the U.S.-China competition in advanced chip manufacturing. So what can we really expect next week?
Well, he's going to make the visit on Tuesday to the plant, and it isn't up and running just yet. It's going to be up and running in 2024. It's a $12 billion investment, so a major investment by TSMC, and 2,000 people will be able to start working there next year. The president is going to see what's called a tool-in, which means that the building is essentially ready to receive equipment to be put into it. But politically, of course, as you referred to, this plant is really a symbol of the U.S.-China competition, of the U.S. effort to really begin to invest in its own semiconductor manufacturing. And this subject came up in the meetings between President Biden and President Macron of France this week, because France, too, wants to be a part of the solution, not part of the problem when it comes to competing with China. But President Macron here, the state visit, and we're just seeing and hearing some of the state visit trappings be removed from the White House, said to President Biden, look, you can't penalize European companies as a consequence of trying to better compete with Chinese companies, referring specifically to recent legislation that has begun to offer more subsidies to American manufacturers in green energy and semiconductor manufacturing. So that did come up, and I also should add that in the statement between the two presidents, the issue of semiconductor cooperation also came up, and China came back and said, look, we don't believe that any proximity or any increasing relations between the French and the Americans are bad, but it shouldn't come at a consequence of what happens here in China. So that will certainly continue, and we'll see likely a victory lap from President Biden next week on Tuesday when he visits that semiconductor plant in Arizona. Neha?
Thanks so much for those details, Jessica. And these are stories we will continue to track very closely with you. Thank you.